President Clinton is being accompanied to California by Chief of Staff Mac McLarty and White House Counselor David Gergen. Also on Air Force One is former President Jimmy Carter. First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton is already in California for the funeral. President Clinton and the 4 living former presidents, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush, will attend today's funeral for former President Richard Nixon. The President is scheduled to arrive at El Toro Marine Air Station at 5:35 Eastern Time. The funeral of former President Richard Nixon is set for 7 o'clock Eastern Time. President Clinton will deliver a eulogy at tonight's funeral for the former president, as will Senator Robert Dole, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and Governor Pete Wilson. The Reverend Billy Graham will preside. You're looking at a live picture from Yorba Linda, California. This is the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and birthplace, the site of tonight's funeral. The public is continuing to walk past the flag-draped coffin of former President Nixon, the 37th President of the United States. The public viewing is set to end at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll continue to show you scenes from the Nixon Library.
You're looking at a live picture of the Nixon birthplace and library, Yorba Linda, California. Seen this scene frequently over the past day and a half as C-SPAN's live coverage of the Nixon funeral continues. The mourners who have been filing past since early afternoon yesterday, California time, have now been turned away. The doors are closed officially to all future mourners. The Associated Press reported that some 25,000 people had filed past President Nixon's casket at the library. For the next couple of hours now, the final arrangements for the funeral service itself expected to get underway at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Time. C-SPAN will be providing live coverage of that event. The funeral service itself is private, 1,800 invited guests, with the Reverend Billy Graham officiating.
Southern conservatives in Washington.
Just landing, you can see, at El Toro Marine Air Station in California, about 20 miles from where we are in Yorba Linda, carrying President Clinton, a number of top-ranking officials from the Clinton administration, as well as officials from the Nixon administration in the late 60s and early 70s, and some others, including former Senator George McGovern. Thank you, Ken Kachigian, for being with us and sharing your thoughts.
I'm sorry about the day to be here, but I appreciate it.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be back with more coverage. We've learned from... Air Force One has landed at El Toro Air Base in Southern California. We will be back with coverage of President Clinton's arrival, and our coverage of the funeral services for former President Nixon continue. But first, we want to let our local cable operators get in a break.
Is CNN.
In just about 90 minutes from now, funeral services will begin here at the Richard Milhouse Nixon Library and Birthplace in Yorba Linda, California. I'm Judy Woodruff, back at the site of the birthplace of Richard Nixon, who died last Friday at the age of 81. I'm here with my colleague, Bruce Morton. We were together a little over an hour ago, Bruce, and then we had to leave because of a security sweep, and you hung in there, and you're back with me.
We're already. The sun came out.
That's right. The sun came out until you got here. It came out. Bruce, we can both turn around and see that there are hundreds of people who are already in their seats, and we can look at this television monitor that the both of us can see. Air Force One is taxiing to a stop at the El Toro Marine Air Station, the place where you were yesterday afternoon when Richard Nixon's body was carried from New Jersey to California. Let's talk for a minute about the relationship between these two men. I mean, Bill Clinton's political career was built in opposition to Richard Nixon. The first campaign he was involved in was working for George McGovern in Texas. He was running the McGovern campaign in Texas.
And even before that, when he was at Georgetown University as a college student, he was working for J.W. Fulbright, the Arkansas senator who so opposed the Vietnam War. He did some work for the Vietnam Moratorium, which was an anti-war organization. He cut his teeth on the war that Richard Nixon was prosecuting. Tried to avoid the draft. He couldn't have imagined two more different people. And yet. And yet. You know.
And not only that, his wife, very active First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton, worked on the House Impeachment Committee. These are two people, we're starting to look at some of the faces in the crowd here at the library. Red Skelton on the far, I believe on the far right. I think we may have we kept moving out of the picture. When the picture's moving, I should say, he was in there. We're going to see some faces that are familiar to all of us. Ken Kachigian, in fact, who
we were just talking to just a moment ago is one of the people sitting there. It's going to be quite an eclectic crowd. Democrats, Republicans, longtime friends, short-time friends of Richard Nixon among them.
And Bill Clinton.
That if this had happened some years ago, the reaction might be very different.
Well, you know, the nickname President Clinton used for himself during the last presidential campaign was the comeback kid. Well, if you want a comeback kid, of course, his name is Richard Nixon. And I think that's one thing they had in common. They're very different kinds of politicians. Richard Nixon didn't like the hands-on, flesh-pressing, all of that sort of personal stuff, working the crowd, and Clinton loves it. But the one thing they have in common is you hit them and they come back.
And another thing you'd have to say that they don't have in common is the great love of international affairs, whereas on the other hand, Bill Clinton, you might say, keeps arm's length. I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. He doesn't probably stay up late at night being fascinated by international affairs, although he certainly had his share of international problems to land in his lap since he came to the presidency, what, 15, 16 months ago.
I suppose you could argue they'd have been terrific co-presidents, you know. Bill, you look after the domestic stuff. I'll worry about China or Bosnia or whatever it is this week.
That's right. This is very much a president whose plane is taxiing now on Air Force One, who is fascinated with domestic policy. And as I was just saying, Ken Kachigian was just saying to me that was not an area that Richard Nixon was his favorite, although he made some great contributions in that area. He was first president. He established the Environmental Protection Agency and other moves. Joining us now from the studio back in Washington, CNN studio in Washington, is Michael Beschloss, presidential historian. Michael, what else do you comes to mind when you contrast the presidencies of these two men?
Well, I think your point is very apt about the fact that Richard Nixon was very much engaged on the foreign side and Bill Clinton elected as a domestic president. I think one thing that really ties the two men together, and I think maybe was a very strong strain, or at least a strong bond between them during the last 16 months, was the fact that Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon are two of the domestic political masters of the last 30 or 40 years. Richard Nixon was known while president and even before then for knowing which ward captain in Ohio to call up to put the arm on a congressman to get some help either in an election campaign or in getting a bill passed. That's exactly the same kind of thing that Bill Clinton has been known for doing. Since they came from two different sides of the aisle, it's very unlikely that they had that kind of a conversation. And the irony is that it's foreign affairs that was the main subject between them over the last year and a half.
It is. There are so many ironies there. Richard Nixon, you've been listening perhaps to some of this conversation, Michael.
Yes.
Was a man of just enormous contradiction, and it's almost become a cliche in the last few days to talk about that. But why is it that, in your view, why is it that someone who could on the one hand be so shy, on the other hand so aggressive politically, on the one hand who could be so ruthless with his enemies and so gentle with his friends, how is it that someone like that could be as successful as he was politically?
I think part of it was sheer will. Nixon used to always say that he was an introvert in an extrovert's profession. This was someone who was tremendously self-disciplined and in a way felt more comfortable when he was in a situation that ran against his grain than when he was relaxing. You know, Judy, in 1979, when Nelson Rockefeller died, Richard Nixon, when he paid tribute to Rockefeller, who was really one of his own old adversaries in the Republican Party, said the thing that he admired about Rockefeller was that Rockefeller could have sat on the beach and relaxed all of his life. He had the money to do so, but in fact he subjected himself to political struggle. Nixon felt the same way. He often said, after he lost for governor in 1962 and after leaving the White House in '74, that unless he was involved in some kind of battle, he would be mentally dead in 6 months and physically dead in 12.
I think that's one of the differences is that you said, Michael, that they were both gifted politicians, and that's true, but they were gifted in very different ways. Nixon was a good political strategist. He could foresee developments. I remember when he was running against George Wallace in 1968, talking to us and saying, oh, he's going to fade, he's going to fade, he's going to fade. But he wasn't a good instinctual politician. He didn't say the funny right thing to the crowd. Clinton, on the other hand, loves the in-person dealing, loves working the room, loves picking up the baby along the parade route. He's just a natural for all that, and it made Richard Nixon squirm.
But why could he be successful when it repelled him to do some of those things that you described?
Well, he was one of the people who helped change American politics. You can argue that he lost in 1960 to John Kennedy over television, but he was the first generation of television politicians.
Really exciting in some ways to see all of these people back together again. Among those on board Air Force One invited by President Clinton to travel along with him, former Secretary of State William Rogers, former Attorney General Elliot Richardson, and former White House Chief of Staff Alexander Haig. Of course, along with Mr. Clinton, traveling with him, Governor George McGovern, who ran against Mr. Nixon in 1972. It's almost, in a sense, gives you a real sense of history to see all these people together, and is reminiscent of back in 1972 when I covered the inauguration, actually 1973 covered the inauguration, and it brings back many memories to me of what a time it was, and what a time it was indeed. Judy?
All right, Bob Vito, thank you. We can see that the crowd there at El Toro is still waiting for President Clinton and some of the others to come down. We have, as we were mentioning, 2,500 some people who are invited guests, the funeral services here at Yorba Linda. There is a huge contingent, I should say a large contingent of foreign dignitaries, many of them ambassadors, in the area behind where Bruce and I are sitting. We're still looking at the door of Air Force One waiting for President Clinton to emerge. There is a large delegation from the Congress. I think I counted away before. Senator Joseph McCarthy. This was really at the beginning of it. Richard Nixon was right in there. Here we see President Clinton coming down the stairs from Air Force One. The plane has been sitting there on the runway for just a few moments, and here's the president being greeted by a military contingent. We don't have any reason to believe that Mr. Clinton will linger at this air base. He's joined by Speaker of the House Tom Foley, the Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, who announced, as we all know, recently he's stepping down this year, Linda Johnson Robb, daughter of the former president, and her husband, Senator Chuck Robb of Virginia. You want to help me, Bruce, with some of the people? We're seeing a few faces there. Defense Secretary William Perry, Carol Browner. Now, there's an interesting face. Now, why would the head of the Environmental Protection Agency come? And the connection, I guess, most of us would make is that Richard Nixon started the Environmental Protection Agency.
There's George McGovern. Who, as you said earlier, did so well in 1972, carrying one state, the District of Columbia, against Mr. Nixon. Pat
Moynihan, now the senator from the great state of New York, but who worked in the Nixon White House. Nixon plucked him out of, what, a Harvard professorship, and
I think so, yes.
Brought him into the White House to work, set him up as, I guess, running one of the several domestic policy staffs that he had in the White House. There we see Jim Schlesinger, who was one of the secretaries of defense, one of three secretaries of defense under Nixon. Vernon Jordan just passed through, a Washington lawyer, former head of the Urban League. Bob Strauss,
yeah.
Former ambassador to Russia, former head of the Democratic Party. Herb Stein, who was an economist, was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Richard Nixon and his wife.